When you ask people why they like live music, why do you go? And people were saying to us, it's a unifying force. We all like music, don't we?
So, this is episode 4 of the Open Muse podcast, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation because we have as our guest Martin Cloonan, who was the originator of the live music census, which is a very interesting part of the Open Muse project. And I think it's going to be very accessible to listeners because everybody's experienced live music at least once, and we've been looking into it and doing some surveys. So the results should be interesting pretty much to anyone. So, hi there, Martin.
Hello, my name is Martin Cloonan. I am the director of the Turku Institute for Advanced Studies, the University of Turku in sunny southwest Finland, and my research area has been for the last 30 years or so the music industries and particularly live music.
Nice, and you're not from there, you're definitely from Britain, right?
Yeah, I'm originally from the UK, got involved in doing research into live music in the UK in about 2002 when I did a research project looking at the value of the music industry in Scotland. And the recording industry is very small in Scotland, but there's a lot of music and there's a lot of live music. And live music in Scotland is kind of economically and culturally dominant.
So it was a good place to start, and it led, I guess, a bit later on to the UK live music census, which Open Muse picked up and carried on with. So let's take it back to where the live music census started in the UK and what motivated it in the beginning.
Okay, so all this does go back to 2002 when we did the report in Scotland. And not only did we discover that live music was dominant, we also discovered that not many academics had researched live music. They were all much more interested in the recorded music, which kind of made sense at one level, but also missed out possibly the most dynamic and interesting sector of the music industry. So with a guy called Simon Frith, I wrote a research bid, and eventually we got some money to write a history of live music in the UK, a 3-part history which is out now and you can buy and available at all good bookstores. And then as a follow-up project to that, we were wondering what we could do, and we came up with the idea of doing a census. We were aware that people had done them in Australia, and we worked closely with the people out there. And really the point of a census is to say, okay, in any given place, what is the state of live music? Is it healthy? Are there issues? How much are people spending? Are they spending enough? Are there too many gigs? Not enough gigs, etc., etc. And so eventually in 2017 we did a census in the UK, and we did surveys of promoters, musicians, venues and audiences, and they were put online. And then on a particular census night in March, we went out in 3 cities and tried to get volunteers to go and gather information from every live music event in the city. Those cities were Glasgow, Newcastle and Oxford, and we did a great big report on all that, which is still available online for free. And also we produced a guide to people saying, well, if you want to do a census of your city, you can, and here's how to do it. It's not rocket science, but it is very labour intensive. And then I got involved in the Open Muse project, and I guess that's what we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, it's interesting to know a bit more about what kind of data points you were collecting from those places. It sounds really ambitious with like 4 different groups that you're targeting. But what kind of data were you looking for, first of all?
Well, I think it kind of depends who you're asking. We were very aware that in any live music event there are different parties involved with slightly different interests. The audience is there to have a good time, the venue's there to make money, the musicians want to have a good time and make money, and the person organising the event, the promoter, they also hopefully don't want to lose too much money. So there's quite a complicated environment in which you're working. And so we tried to gather as much information for people about such things as, okay, if you go to a gig, how much do you normally spend? How much do you spend on merch? How much do you spend on food and drinks? Do you stay overnight in places? And so on and so forth. Because, as I said, live music is very important culturally and economically. And if you look at the economics around a gig, I think most people normally assume that, you pay your money for your ticket, and that's where most of the money's made. But actually, most of the money is probably made on food and drink. So trying to untangle all that can be quite complicated. And I'm not an economist, but I got a guy in to help me.
But it sounds like quite basic. It sounds like quite basic questions that maybe hadn't been asked before in that sector. Exactly,
Mark. Exactly. And sometimes the most basic questions are the ones which people forget to ask. So again, none of this was from my, I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm not a number cruncher, but it is possible to gather information and get the number crunchers like some of the people who are involved in Open Muse to come up with a figure that says, if someone goes to a gig in Helsinki on a Tuesday night, they're probably going to spend €50 on their gig, but maybe another 50 on facilities around the gig. They might go for a meal and so on. So it's that sort of information we were trying to gather. And also, things around, are there particular issues in places? For example, one of the things I think has come out of one of the surveys in Melbourne is, the fact that musicians used to get parking tickets when they were loading into venues. So now you can put a sign outside a venue that says, well, musicians can park here for 30 minutes while they load in their gear without getting a ticket, and you can set up a ski. And it doesn't really cost anything to do, but it's a very kind of practical thing that people hadn't thought of before. And one of the complications around live music is, sometimes you think, we have to deal with the local authority. But the local authority, of course, itself is divided. The planning unit and the cultural unit and the economic unit may not be talking to one another and may have different views on how a venue should operate. So it is a very it seems what you think is a very simple question becomes quite complicated to answer.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you about politics, and you already went straight into it because it's unavoidable. But my question was going to be, how much was there politics involved in your intentions behind doing this survey? Was it completely cold academic snapshot, or did you have some hopes for the outcome?
Well, of course, you want your research to be usable by as many people as possible and all the vested interests. And, our job, I think, as academics is to present the evidence that we found and to be rigorous in our methodology and explain how we did things and how we got the results we did. We then say, well, you're the stakeholders. You can get involved. Some of us who were involved in the live music census were involved in lobbying for certain changes.
And how successful was that?
I think there was some success in for example, in Edinburgh, where I think they eventually ended up implementing a system called the Agent of Change, which has become very popular in certain places. And what that was an attempt to do was to get away from, some venues were having problems where they've been in existence for 20 or 30 years, and then somebody moves into the neighbourhood who doesn't like the noise that comes from the venue, complains to the local authority, and the local authority tend to take the residents' side, even if the venue's been there years. But so what the Agent of Change says is that if you are the agent of change to an existing situation, then you have to take the consequences. I.e., if I'm moving next door to a venue, I have to make sure it's not, I have to insulate my flat so I can't hear the noise. The noise was already there. It's on me. However, if you want to open a venue next to me, Mark, then the onus is on you as the agent of change to make sure your venue's soundproof properly. And that kind of principle has helped certain venues. So we've been involved in some of that stuff. But it can often be very time consuming, and it's not our full-time job. So
sure.
But some of us, and indeed, there was. It's a long, complicated story from the UK, but when they changed the licensing law in 2003, they also changed the rule about whether landlords had to have a license for music, and under the old system, 2 musicians could play in a venue and you didn't need a license. The new system was that every music event needed a license. And so that meant that suddenly landlords, the bar owners, were suddenly faced with a new license, which they didn't want to pay, and so they stopped putting on gigs. And after about a 10-year process, we were involved in a small way in getting that law changed. And so venues didn't have to have a license again.
But those small changes can have a big impact down the chain, right?
Yeah, I mean, we were lucky. We got the attention of a jazz fan in the House of Lords, and he put an amendment to a bill, and eventually, the law changed. But it was a long, tedious process, and it did involve, getting various lobbying groups, such as the Musicians' Union and so on, involved, and the venue owners involved in saying, we need a change to the law because it's having a bad cultural and economic impact.
Well, I'm very familiar with the problems you can have with politicians because I actually was one at some point.
Yeah, and I'm still speaking to you, Mark. That's kind of.
I had one term of office. I think that's excusable. Just to get the experience, see what it's like on the other side. But the changes that you're talking about, I've also been trying to get done in Vilnius in Lithuania.
Yeah,
and like you said, it was a lot of years of not getting very far, and then one of the politicians changes, and suddenly he likes the idea, and everything starts to move.
Yeah, I mean, and that's it. Obviously, politicians come and go, but the issues are there. And I think what I found through doing a number of these censuses is that the big issues are fairly familiar across all countries. A gig is a gig, and it involves drawing people in under certain conditions. But there's a lot of local nuance, which can be very, very important and affect the lives of local and touring musicians. So it's understanding the bigger picture, but also the local nuances. And that's why having someone like you involved in doing this work was so good.
Oh, thank you. I mean, you gave a compliment to a politician, which is
former politician.
Sometimes academics are okay. Some of my best friends are academics. So.
Yeah. None of mine are.
Okay, well, before we go too far down that, let's bring it back to Open Muse, because the UK live music census was taken up as a project which is part of Open Muse. So how did it end up in Open Muse, and how does it fit in with Open Muse's mission?
Well, I think, Open Muse wants to find out, the kind of state of the music industry across Europe. And I was very keen that, we had to do live music, which has been, in the digital era, has been economically dominant. The most important part of the live music economy is, the overall music economy economically is live music. And having some talks with the Open Muse people, we came up with the idea of doing a kind of slightly watered down version of the UK census. I mean, the UK census, we had someone working on it for full time for 18 months, and then a few of us volunteering on the day. We didn't, unfortunately, have the resources within the Open Muse to do that, but we did have very keen local activists wanting to do some version of a live music census in their cities. And one, I think, of the kind of good things from the UK toolkit is that, we do say, well, you don't have to do everything. You can just concentrate on one group or another and do what you can. And I think what we managed to do was pretty impressive, to get 5 cities involved across Europe and get people out and about, gathering as much information as they could, often for the first time. I mean, in Helsinki, for example, no one had a list of venues, and that kind of very basic information was missing. But now
even worse, we didn't have a list of venues in Vilnius either, and I thought we were the only ones. and then
No. I think one of the issues around live music is people kind of take it for granted. Oh, it just happens, don't you? Of course, there's a gig on in the bar tonight, and no one ever thinks about, okay, how does it happen? What's involved? If you go and see a band tonight, what's been, or any artist tonight, or you got a hip hop event or whatever. Who's involved in putting that on and deciding how much it costs and what time it starts and what time it finishes and whether kids under 16 can get in, or what. There's a whole array of things that have to be in place before somebody can get up and go, hey, I'm a guy from, or whatever. So all those things, and people simply take them for granted until they start disappearing.
I think that's one of the built-in disadvantages of showbiz is that we try and make it look flawless and easy.
Well, of course, a few years ago, a sociologist called Howard Becker in the United States, who was also a jazz musician, did work on musicians, and he was his area of research was deviance. So he looked at people who were deviant by society's norms, like prostitutes, alcoholics, drug takers, etc. Yeah. But he did do musicians, because he said, and he was right, that, most of the time we see musicians working, we are playing, we're having fun. So we automatically assume that music's all about fun and not about hard work that goes into it. And you do, musicians, when they're playing, they have to look like they're enjoying themselves, because that's part, they're meant to make the audience enjoy themselves.
I've heard that from promoters more than once, like about DJs, that, well, you're just playing records and you like it and you get girls.
Yeah. So and that's why musicians traditionally have been very underpaid. It's a very insecure. There's a kind of paradox that, playing a musical instrument is good for you. Evidence suggests that. Pursuing a musical career can be very bad for your health in all sorts of ways, because you're undervalued, you're underpaid compared to your peers. I could go on.
Well, so did we find anything out in these cities? I mean, we've established, as I think most of our listeners would agree, that it's a very important thing to keep healthy. So how did these cities compare to the UK and to each other? I
think it's always difficult to make comparisons between the cities, because in some ways each city is unique. It has its own musical traditions, it has its own educational institutions, for example, which can be a big supplier of both audiences and performers and promoters. There's always a danger of comparing an apple with a pear. That's my simple point there. But of course, what we did find was great enthusiasm for music. I think one of the things that music does, and again it's kind of underappreciated, is attract people to places. Students, when they're thinking about where they're going to go and get educated, think, oh, well, what's the local music scene like? Oh, yeah, I might go there instead of that. And some cities have become quite savvy in recent years in promoting themselves as so-called music cities. And in fact, every city's a music city, but it's different. Certainly one of the things that we found in Helsinki, which we need to dig in a bit more, was when you ask people why they like live music, why do you go? And people were saying to us, it's a unifying force. We all like music, don't we? And that was seen as very, in the current political climate, where lots of countries are deeply divided. If you look at Brexit, or you look at across the Atlantic,
let's not look at Brexit. I get your point. Yeah.
What the audience was saying to us is that despite the political differences between people in the same audience, they can unify around their love of music. Now, I need to do some more work and to get back to people and dig deeper into that information. But it was one of the things that I hadn't come across elsewhere when I'd done, not so markedly. Of course, people still loved music, but they didn't refer to it quite as much as they did in Helsinki as being a unifying force.
I think like people aren't really asked that question, or they don't have to think about it much, because it's so automatic to just go and enjoy music.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's true, Mark, and I think again, we come back to the sort of point that the most obvious questions are never asked because we take it for granted. I mean, actually, we when we did the before we did the live music census and we were doing the history of live music, we had a PhD student doing ethnographic research into how gigs work. How does a gig work? And no one had kind of done that before.
Right.
So she went to gigs, and it was a fantastic PhD. I wish I'd done it myself. But she hung out at gigs and was just talking to everyone involved, like the bar person or the security and the cloak people and all that sort of stuff, and trying to work out how it all, how does it all come together on the night.
Well, it's a good opportunity to tell one of my favourite stories about music unifying. I met the a researcher who did a lot of work in Belfast, and she she dug deep into the fact that the only place that Protestants and Catholics ever mixed during the Troubles was in nightclubs.
Yeah.
And they basically had like a Christmas Day football match truce and went clubbing together intensely.
Yeah.
And then the next day they'd be back to work, so to speak.
Yeah, so, I mean, that was certainly an idea, because Finland has been politically divided now and again, and I think people felt that, this idea that music could kind of express our common humanity, I think.
Well, it's another cliche is that the pandemic taught us that we miss it when it's gone. So,
oh, God, yeah.
Well, okay, that's a bit serious, but I wanted to know maybe just a couple of the findings that came out of the European live music census that stuck out to you, maybe the ones that were more different from what you expected.
Nothing greatly surprised me, but it's the importance of local nuance again, I think, in terms of, do audiences think there's enough variety of music? It was interesting that, different audiences in different places had different conceptions of whether their live music scene was healthy or not, whether there was enough diversity. Obviously, one of our cities, Lviv, is in Ukraine, so that had particular local nuances, shall we say, that made it stand out in lots of ways, partly because it was dominated by women, and that was partly because a lot of the guys are away fighting. So that was a particular kind of... but it was amazing to be able to include Ukraine. I'm so glad we did in the end.
It's great to have that data on record now as well. Because we learnt a lot from the comparison to the other cities, which, largely speaking, were similar.
Yeah.
But with the exception of one, wasn't there one city that had exceptionally few venues or activity? Yes,
we intended to do Heidelberg, but it was more difficult to organise there, and eventually it didn't really work in Heidelberg. There wasn't really enough
That's
activity.
That's your survey result, isn't it?
Well, it is. It is, and again, look, in terms of local nuance and things like that, it depends on the small p politics of the locality. For example, do they have a nightmare? Do they have a local music association or something like that? And that helps in lots of different ways, or not, because there might be existing information. For example, in Helsinki, there's a Helsinki Live Music Association, so we could get their list of venues, which they had, and improve it, because they didn't know as much as we did. But also, but if it also helps to promote the census itself. If you're trying to get people to fill out forms, which is essentially what a census is, although in our case it was apps, and we had to make sure it only took a couple of minutes for them to fill out, and we gave them prizes and things. But if you want to promote that census and say, here we are, if you've got already existing organisations that can spread the word and possibly get media interest, which is vitally important, then that really helps. So the local nuance is not just the regulations; it's the existence of organisations that can help you, or the lack of organisations that can. And that was more. I think that was one of the problems in Heidelberg. There was no one who would really help in the way that we needed. Whereas in Helsinki, we did get buy-in from the Live Music Association. So.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things, because we are continuing this idea. We're trying to refine the census and hopefully run it again before the end of Open Muse. And I just wanted to ask, what easy was it actually to get people to fill this in? Because in Vilnius, we had a lot more enthusiasm than I thought. I think people understood that it was good to be asked. And they were quite refreshed that in our case, it was actually the city municipality that was backing the survey. So that gave it a lot of weight and convinced people that it was worth taking part. How did it go in other cities?
I mean, I think one of the things you have to do before you do a census is raise awareness of what it actually means. So if you can get media buying in the first place and that sort of thing, and stories in the press, so that people have some idea. Because if you just walk up to them and say, "Hey, I'm doing a census," they're like, "Well, I don't understand." So we put out flyers and beer mats and things like that, trying to raise the profile. So at least on the night we could say, "Hey, look at this beer mat." And of course we had a barcode so that they could just put it onto their phone and scan it, and it would take them 2 minutes. I think that's the other thing. Especially if you're dealing with partners who all have different interests, they all want their own questions asked. The disability rights people want questions about disability, understandably. The gender activists want questions about gender, understandably. But, when you're dealing with people at a gig, they don't want to spend half an hour filling out a questionnaire. Well, they might do it in the queue for the toilets or the bar or something, So you have to make the app very easy to use, and it takes no more than 2 minutes. That's my rule. 2 minutes, absolute maximum. So that limits the amount of information that you can get. But what we did was also put a final question in to say, "Hey, would you like your name include? If you give us your email address, we'll include your name in a draw for gig tickets." So we managed to get 5 venues to provide free tickets to gigs in return for people's email addresses. So that kind of worked. Most people were quite happy. We didn't bother them afterwards, but at least we have that. We have their permission now. We could follow up and do, one-to-one interviews with audience members, which is very time-consuming but often very worthwhile. And in Finland, we're following up with kind of stakeholder interviews because we want to, do more work, but also get a sense of what people want out there.
And how does it all work with privacy? Because I guess a lot of these questions are definitely going to be personal information.
But
I was never really worried that people wouldn't trust it because it's a European Union project or it's the municipality. But
I think in the Nordic countries they say trust is the Nordic gold. And people do kind of, there's high levels of trust in the Nordic countries for whatever reason. And so they're not as suspicious as they might be in countries outside them, the Nordic countries. So I think we didn't get many people saying, Plus, of course, we anonymise the data, so we would never ask people's names, but we might get their emails if they gave their permission. Otherwise, it would just be, woman, mid-20s, student or whatever, that sort of basic information, but nothing personal.
It does take a lot of trust, but one of the findings, I guess, is that a lot more people just in bars, in the streets, seemed almost happy to be told about this thing. And almost all of them filled it out, and almost all of them got to the end of the form. It was quite a positive exercise. Yeah,
I think it was. And I think people are, if you've got the time to explain, this is the thing about doing the census, it's very labour intensive because, for every audience member you speak to, you've got to spend 5 minutes or so explaining what the census is, explaining that, we're not going to use your data for nasty purposes, but it might make a small change to the we're going to try and engage stakeholders afterwards and talk to the local authority and things like that to try and improve the live music scene in your city. Most people can buy into that. They might not want to fill out the thing, I get it, but, if it's music fans at a gig and you say we're trying to do something for music, you do get buy-in.
That's an easy target. But I want to then look into the future. I've already mentioned we're still running various consultations and designing various ideas with this project. So is there something that you'd want to add or take away based on the last year's census? I
think you always want to do something bigger and better when you've done something. I mean, this time, we only had the resources to do venues and audiences. So we didn't speak to concert promoters and we didn't speak to musicians in most cases. So, it would be nice to do more of that. But as I say, these things are very labour intensive, and labour is not free, so it shouldn't be. So you can get volunteers, and in Helsinki we couldn't pay them. We didn't have enough money, but we did put on an event where we launched the report and gave them free food and drinks. So we made a contribution. I'd like to do a better version with more resources and wider. I think Melbourne's the only place that I know of in the world that's done regular live music censuses, and I think that's if you're going to do this properly, that's what you need, because you need to monitor a changing situation. You quite often read stories in the press like venues are closing, and indeed there are problems around that, but you very rarely read stories about venues are opening. And so what I mean by that is there's no kind of, I don't know of any kind of clear sense of what a natural churn of venues is, because like any business, they come and go. And the trouble is we tend to fall in love with venues, and people get very, very upset if venues close. And in actual fact, it was problems around that caused, I think, the very first censuses in Melbourne. Because, there was a kind of crisis, and then people realised they had to do something. Well,
that was one of the questions in the European census was about the value of the venue.
Yeah. Well, if a venue closed, would you be very upset? And people, so we would. But I think that goes back to our earlier point about the fact that people just take so much of this for granted. I'm very struck in Turku, where I live now. There's no dedicated venue that's open every night, whereas there used to be. So and so that's an issue.
In Vilnius, I had my dad visiting, and I was very proud that I could take him to jazz on a Wednesday night, kind of randomly. We found a venue, and it was one of the venues that's recently won some money from the council. There's now 17, I think, small music venues that got €10,000 each, on a promise that they would put on a certain number of events and variety and safety and all of these extra things. So in Vilnius, I'm focusing on venues, but I was wondering if you'd considered anything about the other parts of the ecosystem. Obviously, there's restaurants and bars, but there's music shops and there's rehearsal studios and other things where clusters tend to form. I'd be really interested in getting more data about that.
Yeah, I mean, yes, of course. I'm very well aware of the fact that not only is live music itself an ecology, but exists within a bigger ecology of what we might call the music industry. And again, you can gather all that information. The problem is someone has to do it, and the more you do, the more labour you need. And so it's not that complicated to do, but it's very time consuming. And that's, we were very aware when we were doing the censuses, I think this time, that this was very much a snapshot. And in some ways, I think it was a kind of a proof of concept. Yeah, we can do this across different European cities. We have the limited resources, but we can pull this off, and we did. And I think that's quite an amazing achievement in itself. And now we've got, of course, we're all thinking, what's next? I think one of the points I would make, and because you brought up the issue of kind of smaller venues and things like that, is politically, I think it's been hard to convince politicians about the importance of so-called grassroots or small venues. Because what they want is a big new arena opening. That's a big story that gets them, a nice picture on the front of the newspaper, and then you can say, oh, Vilnius or wherever has new super venue, and then you hopefully can get Coldplay to come and play in your town or whatever, and that's seen as a big kind of success if you can get the big acts. I mean, I was lucky enough to live in Glasgow, which had a very thriving local scene, but also got the biggest acts in the world, and that was a very kind of interesting ecosystem. So, but I think it's politicians like big projects. They rarely like I'm glad to hear in Vilnius, a few €1,000 for a small venue to keep going. That's I think that's the hard lesson.
As I remember, it was one of the questions definitely was like only 25% of people, I think, in Vilnius said that they prefer concerts in big venues.
Yeah. I mean, that was definitely and that was a kind of universal thing, I think, throughout the census that people liked. Well, that sense of intimacy, you know, where you're close to the artist, you're kind of close to the rest of the audience, and so yeah, people very, very much. That was one of the universal findings, that people like smaller venues, and they're very, very important.
And I can tell any other politicians that are listening that every time the mayor posts about funding grassroots music venues, he gets twice as much attention as he does for building roads or hospitals. So I'm not saying we don't need roads and hospitals, but if you're looking for a quick bump that doesn't really cost much, then invest in your nightlife and your live music venues.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the things that, you know, just simply doing a live music census, you are able to go to the politicians, and we've certainly been able to do it in Helsinki, and say, hey, you know, for not much money, you could make Helsinki a much more vibrant place. And that, you know, and that will just make it a nice place to live. So that will attract people to come and live here. But it will also, you know, bring in tourists. I mean, that was one of the interesting things. You find that people are willing to pay often considerable sums of money in order to go to a live music event. If a particular star is coming for one night only, you want to be there.
Yeah, you can. There's a simple example of competition between Vilnius and Riga, where unfortunately Riga doesn't seem to have such a vibrant scene. And when the pandemic was on and everyone had to register with an SMS before they entered the club, we had a big problem that there were so many people from Latvia that were coming with Latvian phone numbers that didn't work on our system. So we learned. We got some data that people were coming from there, but we weren't hearing any stories of anyone going to Riga for the weekend.
Right,
and that can make a big dent in the income that the city's getting from tourism and attracting students of the future.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, that's why I think the Music Cities thing has been an interesting development in the last 15 years or so, because, you know, it just needs somebody in the local municipality to sit down and think, what about music? I mean, it's other art forms as well, of course, which just so happens that, you know, I care more about music and have done more around music.
But I always use that reason. That's a legitimate excuse. It's politics. You can choose which thing you think is important, and you fight for that thing.
And also, but I would also say, you know, when we've done the censuses, you know, most of the people involved are from a kind of popular music background, but we're very clear we're talking about all music here, and you know, a vibrant scene has great classical music, contemporary music, different genres of popular music and stuff, and that's what, you know, that's the, you know, so the, you know, a good music scene really does have something for everyone.
Well, that is a very good way of ending, because I think you're running out of time and we've had a very fruitful discussion. So I'm going to say thanks very much, Martin.
You're very welcome, Mark. Always good to see you.
And of course, we've got another episode of the podcast coming up, which is going to be with Jaap, and I'm going to find out what that is when I talk to him soon. So see you back here for the next episode, and thanks again, Martin, for episode 4.